Before electric light, night was not a mood or an atmosphere or something chosen for effect. Night was real. It moved slowly through the streets, gathering in doorways, settling between buildings, and stretching into alleys where sound carried farther than sight. And when darkness arrived, it did not ask permission. Light in those years was not something you turned on. It was something you waited for. Each evening, as the sky dimmed and the city held its breath, a familiar figure would begin to move through the streets, lamp by lamp, carrying fire carefully from place to place. Tonight we remember that quiet figure. Welcome to a quiet moment wrapped in candlelight history. I am Amadeo Francis Hawthorne, your humble guide and storyteller. Tonight we wander together into the forgotten corners of the past. But first, if you don't mind, whisper in the comments where you're listening from and at what hour your candle burns tonight. Introduction: A City Lit by Care. This is not a story of invention or progress measured in years and dates, or the triumph of a new machine arriving all at once. It is a story about maintenance, about the quiet work that does not announce itself, but repeats and repeats until it becomes invisible to the people who rely on it most. It is about the people who kept the city moving gently forward, who followed the same familiar routes each evening, not because they were watched or praised or remembered, but because someone needed to walk those streets when daylight loosened its hold and darkness returned to claim its place. The lamplighter did not hurry through this work, and did not linger either, moving instead with the practiced steadiness of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why each stop along the way mattered. Their presence was not meant to be noticed, only felt, as lamps brightened one by one, and the city slowly exhaled, trusting that night would be held back for a little while longer. Long before streets glowed on their own, before light arrived without effort or care, this quiet ritual shaped the rhythm of evening itself, marking the moment when the day released its grip and the night was gently, deliberately prepared. Tonight's reading is called The Lamplighter. Chapter 1: Learning the Night. No one became a lamplighter suddenly, and no one arrived at the work by accident. The knowledge passed slowly, often beginning when a boy was still young enough to walk beside an older man without being asked, learning not through instruction but through repetition, observation, and long hours spent listening to the city after dark. There were no classrooms for this kind of learning, no written guides to explain how night behaved, or how fire responded to wind, or how glass needed to be handled when it was already warm from use. Instead, understanding grew through familiarity, through carrying tools before being trusted with flame, through memorizing routes not as lines on a map, but as a sequence of lamps that each required their own patience, their own timing, their own quiet attention. Many learned the work by following their fathers, or neighbors, or older brothers, absorbing the rhythm of the job long before they were expected to perform it themselves, until the movements became natural, almost unspoken. They learned which lamps burned low in the wind, which glass darkened more quickly with soot, and which streets fell silent first, as doors closed, voices faded, and the city turned inward for the night. This was not work chosen for recognition or reward, but work accepted because it existed, because it needed to be done, and because someone had to move through the darkness with steady hands and familiar purpose while the rest of the city slept. In this way, the lamplighter learned the night, not as something to fear, but as something to walk through carefully, one light at a time. Chapter 2. The rounds begin. When the work truly began, it did so quietly, without announcement, as evening loosened its hold on the day and the city began to change its posture. The lamplighter stepped into the streets at a time when most people were turning inward, closing doors, drawing curtains, settling into rooms made smaller by night. This was the hour between movements, when the city was neither fully awake nor fully at rest, and the streets belonged briefly to those whose work required patience rather than speed. The rounds followed a familiar order not written down, but remembered in the body, each lamp waiting where it always had, each street offering the same quiet signals about how the night would behave. Some evenings were easy, with still air and steady hands, when the flame caught quickly and the glass remained clear. Other nights resisted, meeting the lamplighter with wind, or damp air that clung to the wick, or rain that cooled the metal too quickly, demanding more time, more care, and more attention at every stop. The pole was lifted and lowered with practiced balance, the motion so familiar that it required little thought, only awareness, of height, of heat, of the fragile moment when fire passed safely into glass. One lamp brightened, then another, each small glow pushing back the dark just enough to change the street, to make corners visible again, to soften the edges of doorways and stone. The lamplighter did not linger, but neither did they rush, moving onward once the flame steadied, trusting it to hold until morning came to claim the streets again. With every lamp lit, the city quietly rearranged itself, paths becoming clearer, distances shrinking, the darkness retreating into the spaces left intentionally unfilled. This was not dramatic work. It did not demand attention. Yet without it, the night would have felt heavier, longer, and far less forgiving. By the time the final lamps were lit, the streets had settled into their nighttime shape, and the lamplighter continued on, already thinking of the next evening when the same quiet journey would need to begin again. Chapter 3. Pay, Status, and the Shape of a Life. The lamplighter's work did not bring wealth, and it did not promise advancement, but it offered something quieter, and in many ways more lasting, a steady place within the life of the city. The pay was modest, rarely generous, and seldom discussed openly, because it was understood rather than negotiated, measured not by comfort or ambition, but by whether it allowed a person to continue showing up each evening and completing the route once more. For many, this work was not temporary, nor something endured while waiting for something better, but a rhythm that shaped entire years and eventually entire lives. Evenings arranged themselves around the rounds, meals taken earlier, sleep adjusted to the city's changing posture, days lived with the quiet knowledge that night would always require attention. The lamplighter occupied an unusual place in society, neither invisible nor celebrated, recognized without being singled out, known without being discussed. It was work that carried a certain trust, a belief that reliability mattered, that showing up consistently counted for something even if it left no record behind. There was dignity in that steadiness, in being depended upon without applause, and in understanding that the city's calm was built not only by grand decisions, but by countless small acts repeated faithfully over long stretches of time. For those who did this work year after year, the city became familiar in a way few experienced, known not by its busiest hours, but by its quietest ones, when streets revealed their true shapes and buildings stood without performance. In this way, the lamplighter's life was shaped less by moments of change than by continuity, by returning again and again to the same lamps, the same streets, and the same quiet responsibility of keeping the night in order. Chapter 4: Risk, Fatigue, and the Long Night. The lamplighter's work was quiet, but it was never without risk, even on nights when the streets appeared calm and the air seemed willing to cooperate. Gas was a patient thing, useful and dangerous in equal measure, and it demanded respect from anyone who worked closely with it night after night, without protection beyond experience and care. A poorly sealed lamp could leak, a sudden gust of wind could shift a flame, and a moment of inattention could leave glass cracked, metal overheated, or fire behaving in ways it was never meant to. These risks were not spoken of often, because speaking of them did not remove them, and the work still needed to be done whether conditions were kind or quietly hostile. Fatigue arrived slowly, settling into the body over years rather than nights, as walking the same routes in all seasons taught muscles to move even when the mind grew tired. Winter nights stretched longer than others, with cold seeping through gloves and coats, metal biting at bare skin, and breath visible in the lamplight as the city slept more deeply than it did in warmer months. Rain added weight to every step, slicking cobblestones beneath careful feet, cooling lamps too quickly, and forcing the lamplighter to slow, to adjust, and to remain present with every motion. Pay for this work was modest, rarely generous, often just enough to continue, and seldom enough to make the labor feel temporary or easily replaced. Yet most did not think of the work in terms of danger or reward, but in terms of completion, of finishing the route, of knowing each lamp had been tended, and of leaving the streets as they were meant to be for the night. By the time the rounds were done, the lamplighter's body carried the memory of every stop, every lift of the pole, every pause beneath glass and flame, even as the city itself seemed unaware of how much effort had gone into its calm. And when the night finally released them, there was little ceremony in its end, just the quiet understanding that rest would be brief, and that evening would return again, bringing with it the same darkness that always needed walking through. Chapter 5: A Familiar Presence. By the time the lamps were lit, the city no longer felt entirely empty, even when the streets themselves remained quiet and footsteps were few. The lamplighter was known, not by name in most cases, but by rhythm, by timing, by the steady appearance that marked the turning of the evening hour. People learned to expect that presence, to measure the night by it, noticing when the lamps brightened and feeling reassured that the familiar round was underway once again. Shopkeepers finishing their day watched the glow arrive at their windows. Travelers timed their journeys by which streets were already lit, and those walking home alone felt the quiet comfort of knowing that someone else was still moving through the city. The lamplighter did not stop to converse, but greetings were exchanged nonetheless. A nod, a brief word, a shared understanding that both were witnesses to the night as it unfolded. In moments of trouble, it was often the lamplighter who noticed first. A door left open, a fallen figure, an unusual silence where sound should have been. Not because they were searching for danger, but because their work required attention to the smallest changes in familiar streets. This attentiveness made them a quiet safeguard, an unofficial presence woven into the fabric of the city, offering reassurance simply by continuing onward, lamp by lamp and street by street. Their role was not written into law nor celebrated publicly, yet it existed all the same, felt more than acknowledged, and relied upon more than anyone admitted. As the night deepened and most windows darkened completely, the lamplighter's work took on a different weight, becoming less about illumination and more about companionship in a city that would otherwise be left entirely to the dark. When the final lamps were checked and the streets settled into stillness, the lamplighter moved on quietly, leaving behind not just light, but the lingering sense that the city had been watched over, if only for a while. Chapter 6: When the Light Changed. The change did not arrive all at once, and it did not declare itself as an ending, but moved quietly into the city, appearing first in places where novelty was expected and where tradition was already beginning to loosen its hold. At the edges of familiar streets, a different kind of glow began to appear after dusk, steady and immediate, arriving without flame, without preparation, and without the careful pause that had always marked the coming of night. This new light did not flicker or hesitate, and it did not wait for anyone to arrive carrying it, spilling outward instead with a confidence that felt modern, efficient, and quietly irreversible. For a time, the two kinds of light shared the city, existing side by side without comment, gas and electric, flame and filament, as if the streets themselves had not yet decided which future they would follow. During those years, the lamplighter continued their rounds, moving through neighborhoods that still relied on flame, even as nearby avenues glowed steadily on their own, lit by unseen systems rather than familiar hands. There was no single evening that marked the end of the work, no final route completed beneath watchful eyes, and no ceremony to acknowledge that something essential was quietly thinning away. Instead, the work changed shape. Routes grew shorter. Lamps that had once required nightly care were sealed, removed, or left unlit, their absence explained only by convenience and the promise of progress. Some lamplighters were reassigned, their knowledge folded into other forms of labor, maintaining gas lines, cleaning streets, or working behind the scenes where their familiarity with the city remained useful, if no longer visible. Others watched the work fade gradually, evenings becoming quieter in a different way until there was no route left to follow, no lamp waiting in the dark, and no reason to step into the streets at the hour when night used to begin. The city grew brighter, And at the same time, something subtle slipped away. The moment of transition, the sense that darkness arrived slowly, guided and moderated by a human presence moving ahead of it. Light no longer needed to be carried or checked or trusted to hold through the night. It arrived on its own, without footsteps, without memory, and without the quiet figure who once prepared the streets carefully, one lamp at a time, for everyone who would follow. Chapter 7. When the work passed from hand to hand. In some neighborhoods, a boy grew up seeing the same figure move through evening streets, watching the pole lift and lower, watching the flame catch behind glass, and learning, without being told, that the night had a rhythm and that someone had to keep it. This knowledge was rarely written down because it lived in the body more than on the page, and it passed from one person to another in the same way many kinds of working knowledge once passed, through repetition, through correction offered softly, and through the quiet trust that grows when someone is allowed to do a little more each night. In this way, the work passed hand to hand, not like a ceremony and not like a gift, but like an inherited rhythm, something taken up because it was there, because it was understood, and because the city still required it. For a family, it could mean steadiness, a predictable trade in an unpredictable world, a way of knowing that even if life changed, there would still be a route and still be lamps waiting in the dark for someone to arrive with careful attention. And yet, even this kind of inheritance, this quiet passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, could not protect the work forever because the city was already beginning to learn how to light itself without footsteps. So there were evenings later on when a young man who might once have taken up the pole found that the route was shorter, or gone, or that the lamps he had learned as landmarks of childhood had been replaced by a different light entirely, a light that asked nothing of him and therefore offered him no place within it. And still, the knowledge remained for a time, held quietly by those who had learned it. The feel of the pole's weight, the habit of watching wind, the careful respect for flame and glass, even as the city moved on, carrying its brightness forward without remembering who once brought it. Chapter 8. What Remains. In its earliest years, gaslight was not seen as something ordinary, but as a promise, a visible sign that the city was stepping forward, leaving behind the dim uncertainty of candles and oil lamps, and allowing night to become something lived in rather than endured. When gas lamps first appeared along streets and inside theaters and homes, they transformed evening itself, casting a steadier glow that invited people to stay out longer, to gather, to move through the city with a confidence that had not been possible before. Yet even as gaslight symbolized progress, it carried reminders of its limits. The heat trapped behind glass, the soot that darkened ceilings and hands, the flicker that never fully settled, and the quiet awareness that fire, however useful, always required respect. As the century moved on, another kind of light began to appear, one that promised brightness without flame and illumination without constant care. Electric light arrived first as a marvel, demonstrated in select places where people gathered, in theaters, stations, and grand public spaces, where its steady glow felt almost unreal, as though night itself had been persuaded to retreat. At first, this new light belonged mostly to the future, expensive, experimental, and distant from everyday life, while gaslight continued to serve the city in the familiar way it always had. The change that followed was not sudden. It unfolded gradually as systems were built, costs lowered, and confidence in the new technology grew, until electric light spread outward from public halls to streets and eventually into homes where night was no longer something to prepare for. By the early years of the next century, the glow of gaslight had largely retreated from urban streets, replaced by a brightness that asked nothing of human hands and required no one to walk ahead of it. The city became safer, cleaner, and more efficient, and at the same time, something quietly personal was lost. Darkness was no longer introduced gently, nor escorted into place by flame and footstep, but simply erased at the press of a switch, turning night into opportunity and progress into a constant presence. This transformation reflected the spirit of the age itself, a belief that innovation could improve not only streets and buildings, but the human condition, that light could push back uncertainty, and that technology could carry society forward without needing to look behind it. And yet, in a few preserved streets, in quiet parks, and in the corners of memory, gaslight still glows softly, not as necessity, but as reminder. A reminder of a time when night arrived slowly, when light required care, and when someone walked the city each evening so that others could find their way. The lamplighter no longer makes those rounds, but the shape of the work remains. In the way we trust light to be waiting for us, in the way cities still depend on systems most people never see, and in the quiet truth that progress is built not only by invention, but by the forgotten hands that once kept the dark in order.